Well, good evening, everybody. And I always get a kick out of I'm supposed to introduce our speaker, and we have this huge display. So obviously you've got a little bit of an idea already. But anyway, um, Matt is with our local Spokane, Washington DFI, and he could talk about a lot of different things. Uh, in fact, I I enjoyed seeing that uh, he has done some uh, capturing of sharp-tailed grouse outside our state and released them here in Washington. He's also worked with elk and cougars, and he's even tackled a turkey in somebody's house that crashed through their window. So anyway, lots of fun stories, I'm sure. But obviously tonight he's here to talk to us about moose, and he's even brought some show and tell items in the back, so we'll enjoy that as well. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, Matt. Greatly appreciate it.
All right, let's see. All right, sounds like it's working. Thanks for that introduction, Gary. As he said, my name is Matt Brinkman. I'm the Assistant District Wildlife Biologist. So, a big mouthful of words that basically means I do a lot of work with different wildlife species. So, with our agency, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, we have some species specialists who may work on one or two species, and that's about it. For us district biologists, we're more of a generalist, which means we work on everything from butterflies up to the moose we're going to talk about tonight. So a lot of different species. The way we have it broken down in the state, we have districts throughout the state. I am one of two biologists that covers District 2, which is Spokane, Lincoln, and Whitman counties. So the two of us kind of do all the different wildlife surveys in that area. And it's an area bigger than the state of Connecticut. So there's a lot of animals that live there and a lot of ground to cover. So we can't possibly get to it all. But some of the examples that I know you guys are familiar with here in the room, things you might see around Spokane, right? So we have plenty of turkeys, a lot of different songbirds. Our friendly marmots are out and about and causing all sorts of problems right now. We get deer and coyotes in town. And then, of course, moose, right? Moose in Spokane. It's one of the few places in anywhere really in a big city where you're going to see moose. So we're pretty lucky in that regard. At least that's the way I feel. Some people might not, but so tonight I'm going to walk through these different things. We're going to learn about some moose biology. I'll go through some basic biology. We'll talk about ecology, so how moose interact with the environment, the habitat they live in, their diet, stuff like that. I'm going to talk to you about what we do as an agency, how we're managing moose in the state. Really, I want to dive into a new project we've been working on. We started in 2024, so we'll go through some of the work we've been doing, kind of changing how we're looking at moose. And then we'll wrap it up with some moose safety because big animals that can stomp on you. We got to make sure we cover that one. So the basic biology, moose are our largest member of the deer family, right? Here in Washington, we have white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose. And we used to have caribou. They're not here anymore, but we had 5 different species of the deer family, moose being our largest. And then here in Washington, we actually have the Shiras moose, which is the smallest subspecies of moose anywhere in North America. So you can kind of see the map there. This is a little bit of an outdated map because now even Nevada has some moose, like northeastern Nevada. They have some Shiras moose, but we have that subspecies that kind of comes down through the Rockies there. And then you get into Canada and up into Alaska, those moose are a lot bigger. So our moose here get to be a height of 4.5 to almost 7. And if you look at those weights, those are still really big animals. So even though this is the smallest subspecies, the females, also called cows, are 600 to 800 pounds. Really, really big animals. The males can top 1,000 pounds. So, and then they can get to be roughly 8 to 15 years old is about the range we see. It's life expectancy. The oldest moose, I think, was 22 years old, at least the one that I know of in the wild. And we usually consider like a bull moose to be in their prime around 6 to 8 years. And that can depend on their nutrition and other environmental factors. But typically, that's when they're reaching their largest antler potential. They have their mating season in September. Usually it's about mid-September to mid-October. And we call it rut. So it's the same as all the other deer species. So breeding season is the rut. They usually have 1 to 2 calves and they're born in May or June. So gestation's about 231 days. So just under 8 months. When that cow comes into heat, she's usually only in heat for about 12 to 26 hours. So not that long. So during the rut, the bulls are covering a lot of ground trying to get to all these different cows to check to see if they're in heat. And so during that time of year, you might see more bulls than you would at other times of year just because they're covering so much territory. When the calves are born, they weigh about 35 pounds and they're putting on almost 2 pounds a day when they're nursing. So they're growing pretty quickly. And they usually stop nursing when they're about 5 months old. During this time, when the calves are pretty small, the cows are very protective of those calves. And when we get into the moose safety later on in the talk, this is one of the things to watch out for. If you see a cow with calves, she will protect those calves. So you have to be careful around them. Usually they're independent around a year. So the calf will stay with them until mom has her next calf. So a lot of times late in the winter, you might see 2 moose about the same size. A lot of times it's mom with a yearling calf. So they stick around for a while. They usually reach their full size around 4 to 5 years. Yeah. So I don't know what the drawing is. I don't know if I did that. Oh, okay. Like that's on every slide. I didn't put that there. All right. Yeah, so heat stress. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so heat stress. These animals are really big and they're adapted to cold climates, right? And so what we see with these warmer weather cycles we've been having is moose are actually struggling. They have hollow hair on their coat. They put on their winter coat and it's built to insulate them in these really, really cold conditions. And so I put those numbers at the bottom. Anything over 60 degrees in the summer is too hot for a moose. And in the winter, anything above freezing, right? And so these winters we've been having we have weeks at a time where it doesn't get below freezing. If a moose is doing anything other than kind of laying around and doing a little bit of foraging, they get too hot. So if people are pushing them around, if they're getting moved around, they can get stressed out. They run into some heat stress issues. So, um, but yeah, one way to cool off is to climb into a swimming pool, right? Um, and then the other thing that I mentioned here, they have a 4-chambered stomach. So they're just like a cow. They're a ruminant, right? And so they have a lot of processes going on digesting their food, and that creates a lot of heat. And so when they have these really thick, warm, insulating coats and they're creating all that heat and it has nowhere to go, that's another reason that it leads to this heat stress. Their winter coat, their hair can be up to 10 inches long. It's like 5 to 10 inches long in places. So really warm coats. There was research done in the early 2000s that suggested that moose on the periphery of their range are actually adapting to warmer conditions. So they actually can adapt to that. But for the most part, in the core of their range, they're not very good at handling the heat. I always like to bring this up in these talks about moose. We hear people, and this is kind of a biologist pet peeve. We hear people saying, "I'm going to go horn hunting," and they're out looking for these shed antlers. And there's a big difference between antlers and horns. And so I just want to get into that really quickly. Antlers are true bones. They grow these every year, these large bones, and then they fall off. And so they're shedding these antlers off. So antlers are growing every year and falling off, which is different than horns. And you can see that moose is shedding the velvet. So when they're growing their horns, they have that velvet coating, which is where all the blood vessels are going to kind of help support the antler growth. It's feeding the blood and nutrients to those antlers as they grow. Once that process is complete and that turns to hard bone, they'll start shedding the velvet off. And so that's what's going on in that picture. And then you can see this bull over here. He lost his antler there, but you still see the base where the antler grew from. So that's different than horns. Horns grow throughout their life and never shed, right? They have two parts. There's a bone core and then a keratin sheath on the outside. And so a couple examples, bighorn sheep and mountain goats. You can actually tell how old those animals are because they have growth rings on the horn. And so you can count those growth rings. We call them annuli. And you can tell how old that animal is based on how many growth rings it has. Pronghorn are kind of funny. They always fall into this weird category. They have horns, but they actually shed their sheath every year. So you can't tell how old a pronghorn is by the sheath, but they still have that bone core that is always sticking up even after they shed that. All right, so moving on to ecology. And like I said earlier, this is how moose interact with their environment. So talking about what kind of habitat do moose like? Well, you usually see them around lakes, wetlands, riverbanks, anywhere there's a lot of willows, deciduous, woody shrubs, aquatic vegetation. They have that weird long snout that's adapted to kind of sticking their head underwater and eating aquatic vegetation. So this tends to be more of their spring and summer habitat. It also helps them cool down being close to water. But in northeastern Washington, we see moose in a lot of this habitat. So it's a mix of this young and old forest. We have these different cirral stages. They really like that shrub cover. A lot of times, you know, these like 10-year-old cuts and old burn scars where the shrubs are starting to come back. That's what a moose really loves to hang out in. And so this is kind of the other type of habitat. And we see moose a lot in this habitat in northeastern Washington. So logging and fire are actually really good for moose. It creates this patchy habitat that provides really good habitat. And then the patchiness, having some older forest provides thermal cover. So they can come out into these cuts with the shrubs to eat, and then they can go tuck back into that thermal cover, which in the summer can give them shade and in the winter can actually protect them from some of the elements. We will see sometimes if we get like a really heavy snow year, we will see a seasonal migration where moose are coming down off those higher elevation areas where the snow gets a little too deep. But you see how long moose's legs are, right? They can make it in pretty deep snow for a long time. And so they'll stick it out as long as they can up high. But sometimes you will see moose coming down, getting lower. And so you'll see more moose in the valleys on hard winters. The last couple winters, when we go to look for moose, they're at the very tops where there's any amount of snow, and they will just lay in the snow. And then obviously here in town, we see them anywhere there's fruit trees, apple trees, things like that. Really nice landscaping with well-tended shrubs. They love eating those. Swimming pools. I think that picture came from the Painted Hills neighborhood of Spokane Valley. So yeah, big bull moose just hanging out in a swimming pool, trying to cool down in the summer. Yeah, a little different here in town. Their home range is generally around 3 to 6 square miles. It can get as high as about 35 square miles, but generally it's on the smaller end. And you'll see that later on. I have some data to show you from a study we're doing. So what do moose eat? Well, it changes seasonally, right? In the summer, they're going to be eating the green vegetation out there. Anything, all those fresh shoots and leaves. I mentioned the aquatic vegetation. They'll stick their heads down and rip up weeds out of the lake floor. But in the winter, that stuff's not available. And, you know, they can't just go down to the grocery store and buy some fresh produce, right? So they're going to take what they can get. And they're they're browsers, so they're not out there grazing like a cow. They're not eating all the grass that they can find. They prefer woody browse. And so that stick there, they'll go down to about the diameter of a pencil and just chew down the woody browse. And you can see that bull up there that, he's shed his antlers, but he's chewing on the bark of the tree. So they'll rip bark off of trees and eat that too. And so it really changes to more of a woody diet in the winter. Uh, in the summer, moose will consume up to 24 pounds of forage per day. In the winter, that's about half, just because there's not that much to eat out there, right? So how can we tell a moose is in an area? As a biologist, that's important to me. I want to know where moose are hanging out. If I'm going to do a survey and they are changing their range seasonally, I want to look for stuff, right? Signs that tell me a moose is there. And so obviously, poop is a great way to figure out what's out there, right? And I just mentioned their diet changes. And because of that, their scat also changes. So the two images where it looks like a more firm pellet, that's their winter scat. If you look where it's broken apart, that scat is almost like sawdust, like you'd expect on like a wood shop floor, because all they're eating is wood. And so you break those pellets apart, they're super dry and it's just like wood fibers in there. In the summer, they're eating more, there's so much more water in their diet that their scat kind of sticks together, it clumps together, and it doesn't have that distinct pellet look to it. And so just knowing, like, if I'm going to do a survey in the winter, that's the type of scat I'm looking for in the winter to tell me that's where I need to be looking. If I'm finding this type of scat, that's telling me it's summer range. And if I'm doing a winter survey, that might not be the best place to be looking. So those things are important. Obviously, tracks. Everybody has probably seen some type of tracks out there, right? Moose tracks are just, they have hooves. So you're looking for those really large hooves. You get some overlap with elk, obviously, in this area. Sometimes there's size overlap. Generally, moose are bigger, right? We're looking at about 6 to 6.5 inches long on those front feet. The hind feet are usually a little bit smaller, more in that like 4.5 to 5.5 inches, but still really big hooves. Okay, so moving into moose management. I'm getting more red marks on the screen. Okay, so this picture is actually some of the other biologists that work right now in the office. So we have a moose project that's ongoing, and I'm going to talk about it here in a little bit. But that's actually up on Mount Spokane. That's one of the moose that has a collar on her right now. Just taking a step back, I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson about moose. So 100 years ago, we didn't have any moose in Washington. The first known sighting of moose in Washington was 1929. And that was a hunter up in Ferry County took a picture of a bull moose. And so we had evidence that, hey, a moose showed up. It wasn't really until the 1950s when we started to pick up more sign. There were biologists that were doing work in the Selkirk Mountains, and they found some shed antlers, and they actually found some moose carcasses. And that's when they were like, okay, well, maybe they are moving into the area. By the 1970s, there was about 60 moose that had established. It was a small but stable population. And then in 1977, our agency decided there were enough out there that they could start issuing some tags to the hunters. So it started with 3 permits in 1977. That population just started to explode. By the mid 2010s, we were at around 5,000 moose in northeastern Washington. Yeah. And there was a study done, and I don't remember if I think I talk about it in the next slide, but it was around 2014, a study started, and they were doing some robust aerial surveys and trying to get at a population estimate. And it was just over 5,000 moose. Another study done just after that suggested that that was probably our max that we could fit in that area. And they thought the population was starting to decline after that point. So our agency, there's a few different things we've been looking at. Now that we consider moose a game species, we've been considering them that since 1977. we can collect some harvest data. So we're getting data on the moose that get harvested from our hunters. Um, Last year, we issued 105 bull tags and 30 cow tags statewide, but they're basically in northeastern Washington. Um, and we estimated 79 moose were harvested last year. There are a lot of caveats that come with the harvest data. Um, there are things you can look at that kind of give you an idea of trends, but we look at hunter success rates, but that relies on hunters actually reporting to us that they hunted and they were successful, which, sometimes doesn't happen. I think we're at about 60% of people that actually report back to us afterwards. Um, and then you also have the fact that not every hunter was created equal. So we look at how many days it took to harvest a moose, and we kind of use that as a trend. If all the hunters are having the same thing, it's taking them 2 weeks or 3 weeks to find a moose, that suggests to us that they're having a hard time finding moose, and maybe there aren't as many moose in that unit as there used to be. We don't know that for sure. It could be one guy that went out and just drove roads and didn't see any moose on the road. And we don't have a way to get at that. So it gives us some data, but it's not the best data. So we use that as it gives us general trends. But we also wanted to tie in aerial surveys. And so we were doing aerial surveys to count moose. And we would generally do those in the winter when moose are easier to see. You get that nice snowy backdrop in this big, dark animal, and they stand out. So you can get a pretty good count. But the winter snowpack has been really inconsistent. So you book your time, like we're going to go do a survey right now, and there's no snow. Well, now you still have to do your flight because helicopter time is hard to come by, and you can't just say, oh, let's do it next week instead, because that helicopter might have other plans, right? And so you run into fog issues, you run into the no snow, so you get up there and start searching, and you can't find moose because they just blend in so well if there's no snow on the ground. So we ran into a lot of issues with the consistency of that type of survey. You might get a really good count this year, and you might go 3 or 4 years with bad counts. And it was really hard to compare between years and know whether it was a survey issue or if it is a population thing going on that you're noticing. So in 2024, we started this new project, and I'm going to mostly talk about that because that's what I'm familiar with. And the idea was that our population of moose is thought to be declining in northeastern Washington. We want to know if that's true and why that might be, right? I mentioned those historical survey methods do have some limitations. And so we have this need to find a more consistent and effective way to monitor these moose. And we also want to enhance our knowledge about these proximate causes of mortality and examine impacts of ticks on moose. So I'll show some pictures later, but I think everybody has probably seen pictures or seen the moose that almost look white, right? They've had hair loss. A lot of times that's related to the tick load. And it's specifically these winter ticks, which is a different species of ticks than the one you would find when you're hiking right now. They're actually climbing onto the moose as these really small larval stages in like October, November. And the thought is that with these milder falls we've been having, these ticks have a longer questing period when they're out grabbing onto their host. And so the tick load is getting higher and higher on these mild years. So those are some thoughts, but that was kind of the impetus for this study. We wanted to figure out what was going on. The study area we picked, I mentioned District 2, so that's Spokane, Lincoln, Whitman counties. That's where I work. And then District 1 is the 3 counties to the north. So Stevens, Ferry, and Pend Oreille. It's mostly in Stevens County. So for those of you not familiar, the GMUs are game management units. That's kind of how we manage the different game in those different areas. I didn't put a map up here, but basically it's Stevens County, and then in District 2, my area, it's like Mount Spokane area, and then Five Sisters to the west of Loon Lake. So we wanted to pick areas where hunters were able to get into. So we have moose permits in all of those areas. We wanted to pick areas that have cow harvest and that also have access for hunters. We didn't want to be biasing our sample and collaring cows in areas where hunters weren't able to get to, because then we would be looking at, hunter mortality as not being an issue in those areas. And really, it's just a matter of access. So we excluded some areas where we do have cow tags, like around Cheney and then down by Micah Peak, just because access is pretty limited. And so we're using the data to come up with a population model. That's kind of the idea behind it. So we wanted to get 80 adult cow moose collared over a 3-year period. So we were going out, catching moose, attaching a collar, collecting samples, collecting measurements. The collars, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but they actually can give us a mortality signal when the moose dies. And so we can go out and see what's killing our moose. And then the plan is to eventually create a population model, or a model to estimate this population growth rate to see if our population is truly declining or if we think it might be stable or increasing. And for those of you who are interested, I don't have the details of the model, so don't ask me specifics, but it's an age-structured, female-only Leslie matrix model that we're using. So how do we get them? So we used this helicopter, this lovely American flag helicopter. We got a lot of comments from people about this one. We usually get accused of flying black helicopters around and spying on people, and nobody was going to accuse us of that in this American flag. So it was great. And we split up into 2 crews. So we have a capture crew, and the capture crew, they're kind of the first ones on the scene. They're flying around searching for moose, and they're the ones trying to dart the moose. So it's a crew of 2 people, 2 biologists plus the pilot. So you have your gunner and mugger. So the gunner is the guy hanging out the window to shoot a dart at the moose. Your mugger is the one collecting all the information about where the moose was darted, what time, relaying back to the other team, hey, we got a dart in, be ready to get jumped over here, and all of that stuff. So, and then they're the first ones to the scene. So the helicopter drops this crew off close to the moose, and then you get in, you put a collar on while the helicopter goes back to get the other crew. And a lot of times when you get to a moose, you have to reposition it. They're giant animals and they never go down in a good spot. So you have to, we were cutting little branches and trees and like trying to slide their legs around, because you want to make sure their head is more uphill, because they can regurgitate and aspirate if you're not careful. You don't want their head downhill. So you really have to, that's kind of the capture crew's job once they get on the ground, is repositioning, and then if they have time, put the collar on. And so the volume maybe is working through Zoom, but this is us searching for moose. So that's the gunner looking out the window, and you'll actually see 2 moose down below. Those actually both ended up being bulls, so we weren't targeting those. You can kind of see the way we're trying to figure out if they're bulls or cows. If they were cows, we would have gotten close. I probably wouldn't have been taking a video, because everything happens pretty fast up there. But you get in close enough to put a dart in them, and then you back off and wait until they go to sleep and then land. So the first step for the capture crew is finding the moose. And so this is what you see a lot of times, and I mentioned the snow is important. And you can kind of see how well those moose stick out in the snow. Of course, it's going to depend on how much vegetation they're in. I don't know, can't really see it. Oh, right here. So you see this moose? How many of you noticed moose 2 right there? Yeah, he kind of blends in, or she. So they can be hard to see. And we spend a lot of time just cruising around clear cuts, areas where you have a higher probability of finding a moose. If you're just flying over dark, thick pine trees, there could be moose in there that you would never see. So the first part is finding them. The second part is determining, is it a bull or is it a cow? We want to catch cows. That was our target, to get these collars out. So sometimes it's easy. But I talked about shedding antlers, right? And we're catching them at the time of year when most of the bulls have shed their antlers. So you can see in this picture on the right, there's one bull that has his antlers. Those other two moose are most likely bulls as well. They just don't have antlers. The one on the picture on the left, that's a cow with two calves. And so when you're seeing calves running with an adult, that's a really good indicator. It's probably a cow. It's not always the case. It's usually a cow though. And so that helps right away. If it's just one moose standing out there, it can be really tricky. So the thing we look for is called a vulva patch. And you can see on that middle picture, there's a white patch on the rump. And that's what we're trying to see from the air. We're trying to look at that because most of them don't have antlers, and trying to find that little base where the antler was attached can be really hard to tell as you're flying around quickly. And I guess both those pictures on the left, you can see the white. When they're laying down, and sometimes these moose, they don't care that there's a helicopter flying over. They will just continue to lay there, and you have to kind of circle around them until they get annoyed enough to stand up, and then you get to see. But they don't always cooperate. So again, bull or cow, right? The one on the left has a collar on it. You can see that white patch. This one on the right is actually a bull that we darted by mistake because it had a white patch. And we didn't realize that until we got on the ground. So we got on the ground, we can administer reversal drugs to get them back up and release them. But yeah, I mean, pretty distinctive one. Sometimes you get patches of snow that are stuck on the rump that kind of look like a patch, and you have to make these decisions pretty quickly. So yeah, pretty tricky. So then the second crew comes in. Once the capture crew gets dropped off, we bring in our second crew, and the helicopter just continues to leapfrog throughout the day. He'll pick up the processing crew, bring them to the moose. Capture crew gets back on, goes to look for the next moose, while this crew comes in and they take all the samples. They get blood samples, they get everything else we need, and then they're the ones that give the reversal drugs. The moose gets up and runs off. So this was a cool one. Normally we have to like hike through thick brush and snow to get to the moose. This one, she fell asleep right next to the road where the helicopter could land. And so I could take this video of the helicopter coming in with the processing crew. We already have the blindfold on the moose. She actually fell asleep sitting upright. We call that the sternal position. So that's a really good position for her to be in. So she's doing great. We were just waiting for the processing crew to get dropped off, and then we get back on the helicopter and go look for the next one. You can see Mount Spokane in the background up there. You can see the ski runs. So the collars that we're attaching are GPS collars. They're programmed to collect locations every 4 hours, and then they upload once per day through satellite. So we get a lot of locations for these moose. And because they're moose and can hold a really big collar, for those of you in the room, I brought in a collar so you can see what it looks like. I put it in the back. So after the presentation, if you want to go lift it up and look at it, you can kind of see they have a really big battery. So we should be able to get 5 years of data off these collars, which is pretty great. And allows us to look at home range size, habitat use. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they have an accelerometer inside the collar. So if the moose doesn't move for, I think it's either 6 or 8 hours, we get a mortality signal that comes through our email, right? I get an email saying this moose might be dead because it hasn't moved. Sometimes it's a false mort, we call it. If that, for some reason, that thing gets stuck, that accelerometer gets stuck in there, we'll get false mortalities. But most of the time, it works out really well. And so we get this notification, then we try to get out in the field to wherever the moose is and figure out what's going on. If it's dead, what killed it. And then when the processing crew comes in, these are some of the samples they're taking. So we're always trying to get a blood sample. We can learn a lot from the blood. We're actually doing we're doing pregnancy tests. So we know our pregnancy rate on our cows. We get a DNA sample. We were actually doing, the first year we were doing COVID samples from the blood. We do an ear punch. So we take this little punch and push it through their ear so you create a hole in the ear. We're going to ear tag them anyways. So this actually makes the hole, it's a lot cleaner and doesn't bleed as much. We're able to kind of, dab it and stop it from bleeding and then put the ear tag in. And then we take that little punch of tissue to get DNA from that as well. The ear tag is, we call it a call before consuming. So if a hunter harvested that moose, there's a number they can call and we can tell them when it was last darted so they know if there's still drugs in the system. We're doing this work in February. Most of these drugs are out of their system within 30 days. So as long as that month has gone by, the meat would be safe to eat. We're pulling incisors. So for moose, it's really hard to tell how old they are. So the best way we can do that is by grabbing their outer incisor and we send it off to a lab to get an accurate age. So that's a veterinary procedure. So our processing crew always has a vet with on staff and they have to, give a local anesthetic to pull the tooth. We were collecting whiskers there was a lab doing stable isotope analysis. We look at body condition, which is a scale between 1 and 5, kind of gives us an idea. Are they emaciated or are they obese? Which you're never going to see an obese wild animal unless they're getting some sort of human food source. But just kind of gives us an idea of the condition of that animal, because if we find it dead 3 months from now and it's really emaciated and it was in good condition, something happened during that time. And so it just gives us a kind of a data point that we can look back at. We were doing COVID nasal swabs. I don't think we did that this past year, but that was something we did. And then we were taking some morphometrics, just measurements. We were doing like body girth, go to tape measure around the chest to see how big they are. We're not getting weights, obviously. We can't lift these things in the field, but yeah, so that's kind of what we're collecting. And then we were also doing tick transects. So this is giving us an index of tick load going into the winter. By the time we were doing it, those small ticks that you can barely see had grown a few sizes. They actually shed their exoskeleton to go to the next stage. So we could see them at this point. And those combs were actually cut to the right size. And so we were doing 10-centimeter transects. So you just kind of part the hair and count the number of ticks. And we do it 4 times on the rump and 4 times on the shoulder. And it gives us an index of the tick load for each moose. And then finally, when all of that's done, we give them the reversal drugs. Usually they stand up within a minute or two. It's really quick. And so I just have a couple short videos of the moose walking off right after they got reversed. So sometimes it takes them a little bit to get their feet under them. Usually we try to pull our gear out of the way. Sometimes they stomp on it anyways. And then the second one over there. So then these are some of the early results from our study. These are moose that were collared in 2024, but just kind of showing in that Five Sisters area, you can see Loon Lake. So this is just southwest of Loon Lake. There are 5 moose on top of each other. Their home ranges are all on top of each other. I think that's a 30-day window of data. And so they're just living right on top of one another. We caught them pretty close together, but it was interesting to see. I thought there would be more separation between those moose, and they seem to be using the same areas. Somewhat similar in Mount Spokane. It wasn't quite as obvious, and a lot of it had to do with where we were finding moose. A lot of that stuff north of Mount Spokane had a lot of thick timber. It was hard to find moose. We got over there on the east side of Mount Spokane, and the helicopter came up over a hill, and I think I saw 6 different moose just running in different directions. Like there were a lot of moose in that one spot. So we were able to get our 80 moose collared over the past 3 years. This project started in the winter of 2024. We were trying to get 30 the first 2 years and 20 in the third year. We ended up getting 28 in the first year, so we almost got our 30. The second year, we ran into all sorts of logistical nightmares. We caught 11 of our 30. But this past year we got 41 collars out. So we were able to find a lot of moose and get our 80. Obviously we've lost some since then, but we have deployed 80 collars. The first year of the study, we got the tooth data back, and the ranges in age on those moose was 1 to 16 years old. So we have some really old cow moose out in our study area. The pregnancy rate was actually pretty high. The yearlings that we caught, which we were trying to only catch adults, which would be 2 years old or older, we did catch a couple yearlings that looked big when we darted them and decided we were going to put collars on. They were not pregnant, and then the 16-year-old moose was not pregnant. We had some 12-year-old moose that weren't pregnant. We also had a 12-year-old moose that was pregnant. So you kind of see like, and you expect that yearlings are generally not pregnant. And then once they get over that, toward 12, 13, 14, you expect that they're going to senesce and stop breeding at that point. But actually a pretty high pregnancy rate overall. And then we're trying to figure out what's killing them, right? Since this study started, we've had one of our moose was hunter harvested legally. It was good. He brought the collar back to us. We've had predators kill our moose. We have had a couple weird mortalities that we kind of chalked up to tick related. We couldn't definitively say that ticks caused it, but the condition of the moose and the tick load, you can see the bare patches on this moose. And I'm going to show you a gross picture. So yeah, see some of the ticks a little bit closer. Some of these moose are just loaded with ticks when we come back to them in the spring. And there are some, we had one that was injury related. There was a cow that had her leg looked like it had probably been broken. She had a big abscess and there was infection going up the leg. And she was 14 years old when she died. I mean, you kind of expect moose to start dying around that age. So definitely some natural deaths going on. And then we've had a few that are just weird. They just dead moose with no signs. And we've sent samples off to the lab. And I mean, one of the reports said, I'm going to read it because it said, the most notable finding is multifocal acute hepatitis suggestive of embolic bacterial showering from abdominal organs or general septicemia. So they were like, oh, I don't know, something going on in there. So then just other things that could be threatening our moose. Climate change is obviously having an impact. I talked about how these moose are sensitive to heat stress. With these warmer winters and longer falls where the ticks are able to get on them, it seems like that could have a big impact. The habitat is changing, right? We're stopping fires or trying to stop fires sooner. So we're kind of taking away some of this patchy habitat that they really like. Moose get hit by cars. We get a lot of reports every year of moose that are walking around with broken legs. They got hit by a car. Sometimes they do get killed outright, but most of the time we have to go put them down later because of an injury that they're not going to make it. Predators, disease, parasites, there's a lot of things that can kill our moose. So a lot of stuff going on. We haven't started doing the modeling yet. That's going to be coming in the next couple of years, I would imagine, as we get more data. We are doing some follow-up flights on our cows that we know were pregnant. We do flights the following year to see if they still have a calf at heel. And that gives us an idea of calf survival and recruitment over the winter, whether our calves that are being born, if they're pregnant in February, March, when we catch them, you would expect they're going to have a calf in 2 to 3 months. And so we're just kind of assuming that that's happening. And then we follow up the next year. And if that calf is not there anymore, we know something happened from birth to that, over winter time. So we're looking at that to see if recruitment is an issue, and that could be a cause of the decline in the population, or the suspected decline, I should say. But yeah, now so getting into moose safety, and I mentioned this earlier. Moose are big animals, right? And if they want to, they can do a lot of damage to a small person. So we want to make sure we give them lots of space. You can see these people are not following the rules. So don't do those things. Don't get that close. Yeah, it's just not worth it. These are wild animals. Even if they look friendly and act like they're fine around you, all it takes is for them to decide something's not quite right, and it can turn from this situation to a really scary situation. I tell people when I do bear talks, I'm more scared of running into a moose in the woods than a bear because they are more unpredictable to me. So some do nots, and some of these hopefully are pretty obvious. Don't try to feed the moose. Don't try to chase them with your car. Sometimes they will turn around and stomp on your car and can do a lot of damage. Um, don't let your dog near the moose. One thing that people do is, they have their dog off leash and the dog runs out and finds a moose, and it's going to run back to you when that moose starts chasing it, and now you're on the receiving end. So be careful with that. I mentioned earlier, don't get between a cow and a calf. That's one of the most dangerous times. The other most dangerous time is bulls during the rut. When they're in breeding season, those bulls will do anything to get to a cow in heat. And if you're standing in their way, they're fine to bowl you over. Uh, if you do see a moose, don't approach. Give them lots of space. Change directions if needed. If you have to go hike around on a different trail, do that rather than try to push them out of their way. You can slowly back away. Normally, they're fine with that. They don't have great eyesight, so sometimes if they see something they're not sure about, their instinct is to run toward it and try and chase it away. But we're not very quick, so we can get stomped that way. So be careful doing that. You can, if there's a tree around, if you can put something between you and the moose, moose can't turn on a dime. So if you can stand behind a tree, you can usually swivel around the tree. So uh, again, dogs, keep them on a leash. Things to be looking for if a moose, they're going to tell you, I don't like you here. And things you're going to see are this shoulder mohawk. They're going to start raising their hair on their shoulders, kind of like when a dog gets upset, right? They raise their hair on their back. When they pin their ears back like that moose is doing, that's a sign that they're not happy and they're thinking about coming toward you to chase you away. They might start stomping their feet. You'll see them kind of licking their lips. Looks kind of funny when they do it, but that's a sign of aggression. And then, as I mentioned earlier, seasonal aggression with either calves or during the rut. If a moose attacks you, this is one of the species you should run away. If you think you can get away, run away from that moose. If it's just a straight trail, you're not going to outrun that moose. But if you can get to a tree, if you can get to cover, that's the best thing you can do. That last slide or the last picture there is kind of the last ditch effort. If you can't get away, just get down, curl up, and you're basically showing the moose, I'm not a threat. I'm not trying to threaten you. So you're trying to just make yourself as small as possible and protect your head. Um, yeah, and just teach others in our area about moose. If you do see people around moose, tell them they can be dangerous. We moved a moose last fall that was in Spokane. It was actually on Halloween because the neighbors were worried about trick-or-treaters getting chased by this moose. And yeah, so we moved that one. And then there was another one in the same neighborhood, and it was a bull that decided to strip his velvet off by rubbing on cars. He had green paint on his antlers. And he also had some netting that he got caught in his antlers. And one of the neighbors had said she tried to walk up to the moose to pull the netting off. Yeah. And it pinned its ears back when her husband tried it. And she said, "Oh, let me. He trusts me." And we said, please don't do that. um, so yeah, follow those safety tips. It keeps you safe. It keeps moose safe. The last thing we want to have to do is we don't like relocating moose. We try to tell people, find a way to live with them. They live here too. If we have to move them, we will. But it's kind of our last resort. We don't want to have to do that. So, and that is all I have. Okay. Are you gonna stop sharing or you want me to?
I have
Oh, there it is.
I have a question.
All right.
So Jeff Willis on Zoom asks this question. He says, and he just asked another question. So I got to scroll. We have 5 different moose at different times on our 1 acre near the Thorpe development area the past year. 1 large bull, 2 young bulls, and a cow with a young one. Does anyone know if that info can help fight the development project?
Oh, that's a good question. I answer to that one. You can certainly report it to us. There are some species where we consider them priority habitat and species, and that kind of goes through our habitat program. And they would have a better idea of how that affects development. But I don't believe moose are listed on that PHS. I don't know that for sure, but if it showed up on PHS, which is the priority habitat and species, that would be one thing to look at. And yeah, if they want more information, they can call our office and ask to talk to one of our habitat biologists that would be able to answer that.
Thank you. I also have a question from Joe and Connie Spitz. How do you tell the difference between moose scat and elk scat?
That's a very good question. So moose scat to me always tends to look more like an acorn, like more elongated, where elk scat looks like a milk dud kind of flattened out. And so that's kind of what I use. With scat, there's always overlap. There always tends to be, depending on their diet, there can be some overlap there. And yeah, there are times where I just say it's one of the two without doing some sort of additional test. But in the winter, the moose scat usually looks pretty different. You see those really big woody scats like that. In the summer, it can be really tricky because they're all eating really green vegetation and it's creating more of those like cow pie looking scats. So yeah.
Personally, I have a question. Do you ever see any of the, what is it? The Cutarebra worm, the
The
botfly worm in them?
the botfly worm.
Yeah, the ones that make the worms grow under their skin and then pop out
You know, I haven't seen that on a moose.
on a
No,
moose.
they get nasal bots, like a lot of our deer, especially white-tailed deer, mule deer will get nasal bots.
So I know on the
Sure.
dairy farm, cows get them a lot.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, no, I haven't noticed any of like on their skin or anything. Yeah,
They'll be on their back usually.
okay. Yeah.
Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Collar that, oh, would you collar the cow if it has 2 calves with it? And also the yearlings, if you collar them, do you have to replace the collar if they grow out of them?
That's a good question. So we will collar an adult cow with calves. Usually the calves stick around pretty close by. I have a picture I didn't put up here. We caught a cow this year that had 2 calves, and the calves just stood about 100 yards away while we worked on mom. And as soon as we gave her the reversal drug, she stood up and ran off, and the calves followed her. So yeah, so we'll definitely do that with the cows with calves. We actually prefer to catch those because we know they're good moms, and they're easy to tell it's a cow from a distance. The yearlings, because they're cows, they're not going to grow that much more. So we're not as worried about that. Sometimes if you catch a younger bull, they can put on a lot of mass over the next 3 or 4 years. And so you might be concerned about that. There are ways where you can put foam and other things in the collar that will adjust as they grow or kind of stretch out. But we don't have to worry about that with the moose. Yeah.
I do have one more question. If a hunter sees a moose that's collared, you say it's legal for them to harvest?
Yep. Yeah, and actually we don't want hunters to shy away from harvesting a collared cow. If that's the one they see and they want to harvest it, we would actually prefer that they do, because otherwise it would bias our sample of looking at sources of mortality. If everybody's avoiding the collared cows, now it's saying hunter mortality is not an issue, when in reality, if that cow didn't have a collar, it would have been harvested. And so you don't want to bias your sample that way if you're trying to figure out the causes of mortality in your population.
If a hunter harvests a moose with ticks all over it, does he keep the skin?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because these ticks are winter ticks, they're not reaching their full size until March or April. So the picture I showed you where there were a bunch of larger engorged ticks on the moose, you won't even see that in the fall during hunting season. Those ticks are so small that you wouldn't even notice that they're there. Sometimes you can't even see them. And so if we caught moose, let's say in December, if we did our tick transects, I would bet almost all of our tick transects would say 0, because they're so hard to see when they're that small. So when a hunter harvests their moose, they won't even see ticks. They might see the other ticks that we get in the summer, but not very many of them. It's usually like March and April when they start getting big and gross. Yeah.
Thanks for this presentation. It's really been great. Speaking of ticks, when you do your tick transects and you see a high load, do you ever treat them?
That's a good question. We have not been doing any sort of treatment for the ticks. Again, it would potentially bias our sample by giving them a chance at a higher survival, because we've now given them some sort of treatment. And what we want our sample of moose to be is very representative of the moose that aren't collared out there, right? And so we really have to be careful with that as wildlife biologists, trying to say this sample is completely representative of the rest of the animals out there. And there are obviously, it's never that way, right? Anytime you put a collar on an animal, it can affect their movements, it can affect things. And so you're making assumptions. And so we try to minimize that as much as possible. Yeah.
I loved your talk. And I love moose. And anyway, I lived out in the country in Green Bluff area, and I was new up there. But for like 4 years, I always had these moose. They would come to my apple trees and kill my peach tree. No, a peach tree. They were always out there. And sometimes I'd go out my back door and they would just kind of look, and, they'd let me, it was kind of weird. But do they get used to, and then I was down by the walnut trees one day. I was weed eating and stuff. And I heard this digging. I thought, that doesn't sound real good.
Yeah.
So I went back the next day because I wasn't sure. Same thing happened. It was warning me. Well, guess what? I left and someone took a picture of Mom and the 2 calves.
Oh, yeah.
So I feel that she could have hurt me, but I was just wondering, did she get used? Was she used to me? Do they get that?
Yeah. Yeah. So they will get used to people. They will get habituated to people. And those are the ones that are a little bit more scary because of that. Because they allow you to get closer, they're not going to give you the same warning signs that one in the woods might. And so when they decide, oh, this is too much for me, you're probably already closer than you would be with a wild one. The wild ones tend to be a little more skittish of people. But yeah, it does happen. And so that's an issue with all urban wildlife. They get habituated, and sometimes that is what gets them in trouble.
Drove my car, and I just sat in my car, and then they kind of looked around my car. What do you do if you're sitting in the car?
Stay in there. Yeah.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions, and then we need to wrap up.
I was curious to know if there's any evidence and whether your study is looking at this of inbreeding due to the fact that the population has increased so rapidly.
We haven't looked at that. We will have DNA, so I'm sure we can run some sort of familial analysis and look at that. It's not something that has been mentioned, but we would have at least some samples to do something like that if we wanted to. So yeah, that's an interesting thought. Thank you.
Quick question.
Population in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. What do you think accounted for their dispersal down into this area? They used to be a lot more up in the Selkirk, and then they.
Oh. Okay, what factors might have led to the increase in the moose populations in the 80s and 90s? And then, I assume they increased up in the Selkirks and then moved down into this area. And what factors do you think might have led to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just that it was good habitat and there were no moose there. So they were able to fill that habitat out. Once they got there, you need enough moose to move into an area so that you can have reproduction. And if you just get one bull dispersing in, you're obviously not going to get that if he doesn't have cows there, right? And so it takes time for those cows to start moving into these areas. And so I think that's why you see that delay at the beginning. Once you start getting a population established, that's exactly what they're going to do. As long as the habitat is good, they're just going to continue to grow and expand. And they fill that area and they just keep dispersing into adequate habitat. I mean, right now we're seeing moose down in Whitman County where you would never expect to see a moose, but they actually seem to be doing pretty well in the riparian areas down there and people's apple orchards.
Excuse me, Matt. You talked about the mortality, but do you have some sort of a breakdown as to what is killing the moose? And I'd also be interested in the predator portion, any feel for what's preying on them?
Yeah, so far we've had, in this study of those 80 that are collared, we've only had 2 killed by predators. One was a mountain lion and one was wolves. I didn't do a full breakdown because there were a bunch recently after this recent capture effort. There were some that were likely capture related where they aspirated and ended up dying of aspiration pneumonia later on. There were just a few that I didn't have the data to put up here. So the first round, the 28 collars we put out in 2024, I think we only lost 2 of those moose within the first year. And one of them was hunter harvest and the other one was, we chalked it up to a possible tick related mortality. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's about time that we wrap up. So I wanted to give Matt our calendar and to emphasize we are gathering the new photos for the next year's calendar. And I don't know if there's any time left to submit or not. Okay. Okay, we've got 2 days yet. Anyway, thank you so much, Matt.
You're welcome.
Great program. If we have any questions, follow-up questions, can we send them to you or?
Yeah, and so for those of you here in the room, I left business cards on the back table by the antlers, so you can grab a card. Feel free to reach out to me. I have an email and my phone number's on there. So yeah, reach out. Thank you.